as you know, I had a career, if that's the word to describe it, in local government. And one of the things that struck me in that career of, oh God, 20 years ago now, of local government and being a mayor in particular, was how crazy the boundaries of councils are in New Zealand and the way in which councils think, the destructive way in which councils think, because they all at that time and still to a certain extent still do, or a large extent still do, think in silos. So there's very little what you call inter-district, inter-regional cooperation, sharing of resources and services, etc., to try and reduce costs for the ratepayers. And in some cases, boundaries that don't seem to make any sense. So my neck of the woods, for example, we had Wanganui, Rangatiki, Ruapehu, which all should have been one council, for God's sake, with shared services, but instead small councils like Ruapehu and Rangatiki, South Taranaki would be another one. But it's even worse in the South Island, if anything. Yeah, go and try Waimate, for Pete's sake, Mackenzie. We're not only over-governed, but in all of those smaller councils, there are still significant cost imposed upon local ratepayers because of the staffing requirements and the legislative requirements on small councils and small ratepayer bases to produce the same services as would exist in an Auckland or a Christchurch. One of these, and then there are cities that are analogous, close to each other. Napier Hastings is a good example, where you go, why wouldn't you guys get together and just share everything? And I've often thought that of the next, for our next guest, and that's Nelson and the Tasman District Council, the Nelson City Council, the Tasman District Council, at the top of the South Island, beautiful area of the world, it has to be said, where Nelson is a city. We had Nick Smith on last week to talk about many things, particularly the Resource Management Act reform that the government was proposing. And he is certainly a long-standing advocate for the unification of Nelson City Council and the Tasman District Council in that particular area. But that will only go some of the way. Throughout New Zealand, there have been massive rates rises, and we talked earlier about the Edelman Trust Index. But I would imagine that one area of trust that has been lost in New Zealand is with local government. That's particularly because of the double-digit rate increases that have been felt across New Zealand in a variety of councils in grappling with issues that seem very silo in the nature in which they are being approached anyhow. Well, over the weekend, or certainly last week, sorry, the Tasman District Council, realising perhaps that it was in a bit of trouble financially, and with cost overruns as a consequence of stuff that was happening under the ground rather than on the ground, decided to get involved in a bit of restructuring of their own. And they have decided that they are going to cut back on services to the community rather than overspend in this financial year for the maintenance of their infrastructure. Some of those cuts seem petty and will have a public effect, but nonetheless, they're going to happen nonetheless. To talk to us about them, whether or not they'll work, and whether this is really council delivering services to the community or not, is the Mayor of Tasman District Council, Tim King. He joins us now. Tim, welcome to the show. Lovely to have you on. First of all, tell me, how far is Nick Smith going to get with his desire to have Tasman and Nelson as one Nelson District Council?
Well, I guess it's an interesting debate we've had a couple of times in the past. In fact, we went to a referendum, it might be 9 years ago.
What was the result of that?
So Nelson narrowly voted for it. Tasman voted against. I can't remember the exact figures. It might have been 70-30 in Tasman against, and it was tight but in favour in Nelson City. And I think one of the reasons for that is it's just that sense of representation, and we're a very vast rural area, and as a unitary council, obviously, both Nelson and Tasman, quirk of history, where Nelson, Tasman and Marlborough are all unitary authorities, and it certainly does look from the outside as a very weird model, and you probably never design it that way now, or if you did it again. But I think the concern that most rural ratepayers in a big district like us have is the dominant effect that a centralised urban population will have on future decision making. So I think that's why it probably didn't go anywhere in the past. That
Um,
said, I think Nick and I are both 100% aligned on we're probably do more joint services or collectively delivered services than any other two neighbouring councils in the country. So joint landfill, joint delivery of sewage and water, joint sharing of museums, airport, port, etc. So there's plenty more we can do in that space to get efficient delivery to ratepayers. But my view is, at this point, I don't see full political amalgamation happening that quickly.
no, I guess turkeys don't vote for Christmas either, do they, Tim? I mean, most of those sorts of oppositions tend to come from elected members.
Well, actually, that's interesting because that referendum clearly wasn't overly outweighed by the 14 elected members who voted in it amongst the 21,000 ratepayers.
No, but
So
you set the
clearly at
agenda
that
for it,
point
though.
in time. So
Yeah. But
yeah,
and, no, but no, I'm interested though. Napier and Hastings, as you're probably aware, roughly about 10, 12
yep,
years ago, had a similar argument as well. I think
correct.
actually it was Napier that voted to stay out of it because they didn't want Hastings' debt. And I guess
Interesting, isn't it? Given what you're seeing at the moment, where Napier's debts plan to go from 0 to 500 million in 10 years and 20% rate increases. So, I mean, again, both Nelson and Tasman, I think we've both avoided double-digit rate increases, despite the fact we're unitary councils. And if I look at the rate increases around the country, particularly regional councils' rate increases, which have been not only double digits, but in many cases 20 to 30%. The fact that our rate increases have been below double digits as unitary councils, Nelson had a one-off increase, but that was specifically to do with recovery from significant floods. But I actually think, by and large, we actually do reasonably well.
Actually, well, just on that, because I am, yes, you're probably aware, I am a regional councillor now,
I am,
and the rate increases that you're talking about are excessive. That could be the only word to describe it. But nonetheless, is it time to get rid of regional councils, which is my argument, just quietly, and replace them with unitary authorities, because they seem to be working okay. They work in Auckland, they work in Gisborne, as you say, they work in those three councils across the top of the South Island. Is a regional councils a problem now that we should just get rid of?
How do I put this? Well, I like the unitary council model. It's the only one I've ever worked in, so obviously but I do think it's a preferable model. What I would say, however, is it doesn't do away with the massive challenges that face all of local government in terms of cost. And coming back to the changes we're discussing around rubbish bins, etc., and it does seem reasonably petty, but it's a petty $250,000 a year. And part of it's about behaviour change. The challenge with unitary councils is what you have to trade off and try and prioritise is across a wider range of services you're delivering, and in a very different. So your regional council functions are very different from your TA functions. So when you are having these discussions about priorities and cutting costs and reducing or minimising rate increases, it actually becomes in some ways harder because those priorities are so different. The difference between parks and reserves and rubbish bins and managing water quality or air quality through your regional council function, some of those are statutory obligations as well, so that also plays into it. So while I'm a strong advocate for the unitary model, I don't think it in itself is sufficient to address the very significant issues that local government has generally.
Now, I listen, and I do have some sympathy with you because I had the same problem when I was mayor. All mayors have it. And that is that most of this money that you spend on rates, I think I was up to 80% as well, 75, 80% of my budget each year was spent on infrastructure. So it was on sewage,
100%.
water, roads, footpaths, things like that.
Yep.
And
we'd be very similar. Yep.
And okay, I'm sure we are. But one of the things that we always had a scrap about every year was exactly what and this is 20 years ago, but you're having exactly the same scrap now. You've overspent this financial year $2.9 million, I think it is, because you have to deal with infrastructure costs that have blown out beyond your budget. So you're looking to get
Correct.
some of that money back by cutting community services, and as you've just alluded to,
Yep.
what public toilets are going to be open, when they're open, what rubbish bins in reserves and things like that.
Yes.
It does seem, I have to say, from the outside, and it would have seemed to me at the time too, I used to argue against it, incredibly petty when the amount of money that you're saving is so small, but the effect upon the community is so large. Does that worry you?
It's certainly a concern. I think it's an interesting debate. So a number of the community groups and associations of which we have a plethora, being a large district, discussed this, and by and large they were reasonably supportive of an approach to over time reducing the reliance on rubbish tins and public reserves, particularly on the basis that if you take rubbish to a reserve, there seems to be no reason you can't take it home again. You already pay for your home refuse collection and recycling, which is a significant cost in of itself. And so, a bit the same with public toilets. Where we're considering reducing them is where there are a number of them in a similar or small location. So some of them seem unnecessary. It's not like we're about to go around closing all of the public toilets. So refuse collection is an interesting one because it's user pays, and that's the other key thing, is to try and ensure that people who are creating rubbish pay for its collection and upkeep, and it's not being covered by ratepayers generally.
So do you have a household rubbish collection?
Yes, we do have a household rubbish collection. It pretty much covers the whole district.
So that's paid for by rates, right? So it's 100% rate funded.
Yep. So your household rubbish collection is paid for in your rates.
Yeah. I guess the answer to that, and you would have heard the argument about, because wherever I've seen rubbish taken away, particularly from public recreation areas, and I've always argued this, wherever I see that as receptacles being removed, there's no diminution of the rubbish. So in other words, there are already irresponsible people who just decide in public parking spots or in recreational reserves just to leave their rubbish there anyhow. They don't have a particular social emphasis.
No, people do it now, even with rubbish tins. I mean, people choose to. I mean, that is